Hello. So, I've been reading up a little bit about Egyptian architecture and such because, well, it's kind of necessary for my stories if I want to be accurate. Um, so I thought I'd make a little bit of a video going into Egyptian architecture because it's something that a lot of people think that they know because it's a very popular image of what it looks like. But in reality, there's a lot to it that we don't know and a lot to it that the common person definitely doesn't know. So, our main idea of Egyptian architecture is characterized by temples and tombs and every so often palaces. Most of these that are preserved actually come from the New Kingdom era, so most of what we look at is going to be New Kingdom. And the problem with that is that then you don't really get to see the Middle Kingdom or the Old Kingdom, which take up a gross area of Egyptian history. So the reason that it's mostly tombs and temples that exist now into the modern era is because of the building material that was used. So most of the time in those constructions they would use things like sandstone or alabaster, and they'd use wooden pillars to keep everything up. But the sandstone is a very hardy material when compared to the building material that they used for everything else, like commoner houses and all that. They used mud from the Nile, mud mixed with sand, and then as you mixed it, you formed it into a brick, which was then fired in the sun. And when a mud brick is fired in the sun, it's much weaker than a brick that is fired for, say, in an oven. So it's very easy to break apart, it will crumble, and that means that over time these things will slowly degrade. And unfortunately, to aid in that degradation, a lot of people who lived along the Nile up until the modern era destroyed the cities that ancient Egyptians created in search of the fertile mud and soil that they used in their buildings. And they used that for farming. So, systematically, over the years, entire cityscapes have been removed from Egypt. Obviously, this causes a pretty big problem when trying to recreate what exactly Egyptian architecture was like, but we can still get a good idea of it from the New Kingdom, which is where we get most of our examples, most of our temples, and most of our tombs. So, with that basic knowledge out of the way, we can move on to one of the best preserved large sites that at least I've seen in my studies. So obviously, something that we want to look at is pyramids. Now, pyramids, obviously, very classic. We know what's going on there. We know the stone was mined in Nubia. We know how it was transported. We know how it was built. We know what it looks like. Well, most of us do, at least. Pyramids never used to have those steps, at least the ones that we know about. The really popular ones, like the Pyramid of Khufu and stuff. They had flat limestone surfaces with a gold tip on top, and it was completely stark white. It doesn't really look like that anymore because, again, people from the area, they started destroying the pyramids in order to build mosques and temples in the nearby cities. But anyway, what I wanted to look into is pyramid towns. So a lot of people don't know this, but after the pharaoh dies, there is a significant mortuary cult that continues on after his death. And this is composed of priests, workers, high officials, administrative officials. So it's a lot of people who work in this complex after the pharaoh dies. And they all live pretty much right next to the pyramid. So these pyramid towns were devoted to housing priests and workers who worked in that mortuary cult. And they developed from the administrative centers that were needed in order to administrate the mortuary cult. What we can see here is a division from priest houses and then worker houses. And I want to get into priest houses first because they're quite interesting, quite intricate, and they're a good example of Egyptian architecture taken to its highest extent. And so this is from the Old Kingdom, because we're talking about the Pyramid Age, which was definitely in the Old Kingdom around 3500 BC. So we have on the Giza Plateau, on the eastern side of Queen Khentkhause's tomb, there are 11 priest houses from the 4th dynasty. They are in close proximity to the tomb, and they have a high level of uniformity, which obviously suggests that they were planned by administration for the mortuary cult on the Pyramid Plateau. All of these buildings had flat roofs. They had a roughly square plot of around 170 square meters. The interiors are subdivided into irregular rooms of greatly varying size. Areas at the back of the house, or areas that are difficult to access, might have likely been the sleeping quarters. The large central areas were living quarters. Rooms on the southern side that had ash within them were likely the kitchens, and all of these dwellings are intended to accommodate priests and high officials from Queen Khentkhause's mortuary cult. They are exceptions to the usual architecture used in the day and represent particularly luxurious living conditions for the Pyramid Age and should not be considered a universal standard. Now, for this example, this is from the Middle Kingdom, and it's from El Lahun. It's from Sesostris II's tomb. It's a whole pyramid complex town, and then I have an examination of a singular house. So the city is what we'll look at first. It's a walled rectangle of about 390 by 420 meters. The south side of it is not yet fully studied, so it's not been dug up or anything, so that part of the map is currently not been drawn in. The whole city is subdivided into an east and south complex. This plan dictates the entire road network and the distribution of residential areas. In the north, there are primarily rows of large houses, and they have an area of about 2,400 square meters, and have an open court in the north, in which living quarters on the south are attached. They're built between the two rows of servant and service rooms. The primary facade to the north is accentuated by a row of columns, which you can see in the A section. And a room with 4 columns, B, due to its central position, is believed to be a living and presentation room, because those were pretty common in priest houses. You need a presentation room, you need a ritual room. There are a few drawings people have done of this, recreations that I might be able to find on the internet. And to the west, we can see through a niche at the rear is a bedroom marked by C. And this was all covered by a flat roof that was accessible through a stairwell, or a case of stairs. One unique characteristic of these buildings is a partly roofed inner court. That's kind of fun because it's not something you find everywhere. In fact, it's something that you really only find here. And fortunately, there is an actual model that was built by the Egyptians. It was found in the tomb of Mekhetre. It's a model house that shows a half-open courtyard with columned halls and trees and a pond. And because this was created, we can assume that these features were highly prized and very highly valued architectural features. Now, the columned halls on the south side are open to the north winds, and that provides comfort in the summer when it gets really warm, and that you can see in the A, D, and E section. On the west side, marked with an F, there's a Roman atrium, which we assume is a Roman atrium with the columns on all 4 sides and the central water basin. And within these houses are special granaries with a capacity of over 300 cubic meters, which suggests they were used as a center to feed a portion or maybe the entire population of the pyramid town. Now, as for the worker houses in the pyramid town, well, they're much smaller and obviously much less luxurious because they're not administrative or priestly. There are about 400 living units in Sesostris II's tomb for his Middle Kingdom burial. All of these units are about 40 to 70 square meters. Another example is that in the Valley of the Kings, there is a rare settlement type for workers. It's a conglomeration of 78 single compact adjoined rooms of irregular size. These served as sleeping quarters for the builders in the Valley of the Kings. They're derived from a need for a practical use of the limited space that they had and a need for shelter from the cold winds at night. What's really unique about this is actually the way that it is incorporated into the landscape, because all of the buildings up until this point, and basically all the buildings after this, have been built on a flat plateau that has been made out of sand and rocks and such. But this has actually been incorporated into a mountain saddle, which is obviously pretty unique. I remember watching that Moses movie as a kid, the one by like Disney or Pixar or something, and I remember looking at the palace and thinking, damn, that's a pretty plain palace until you get inside. And that's actually generally true, apparently. So, what I wanted to talk about next was the palaces and the pharaonic homes. So something interesting is that palaces often have several different purposes, and the main purpose for them is cultic and ritual, as well as an administrative center. But something that they're not often is residential. So pharaohs didn't actually live in the main palaces that they used. So they were used mainly for official duties. However, it is believed currently that essentially replicas or copies of these palaces live within the same city that are more residential and for the pharaoh and his family to live in. Unfortunately for us, residential palaces have not been very well preserved. It's mostly the administrative ones. But we can still assume that, there were 2 palaces. And these palaces were very powerful architectural symbols because they were where foreign powers were received and where a lot of different rituals took place. And these buildings were somewhat meant to attest to the power and the presence of the pharaoh within Egypt. So a network of similar buildings actually exists throughout Egypt. For example, when the capital was in Memphis, there was still one of these palace-type things in Thebes or in other such cities, like Bast and stuff like that. These buildings were likely used as a place for the pharaoh to stay throughout his travels in Egypt. All of these palaces were independently organized and independently in their own spot in the economic scale. It's even possible that the pharaoh had multiple palaces within one city, so multiple seats of administration. For example, from Hatshepsut's Red Chapel in Karnak, we have preserved blocks that attest an inscription to at least 3 different palaces within the city, explained by 3 different functions: administrative, cultic, and residential. However, our palaces are best known from the New Kingdom onwards, again because time and preservation. And these known palaces are the Houses of a Million Years of Hatshepsut and Merneptah, and the Ramesseum of Ramesses II. However, our most prominent example is Medinet Habu, which is the House of Millions of Years of Ramses III. So this is situated at the southern end of the first temple court, and it is connected to it by doors and windows. The columns and door frames and other exposed architectural elements are all made of sandstone, so that more hardy material, and then the rest of the complex is generally made of mud brick, including massive barrel vaulting. So the main chamber is encircled by ancillary and service rooms, and it is distinguished by sandstone vaulting and a ceiling of 7.5 meters high. The front is dominated by a central double-columned hall backed onto the center of the entire palace, and a hall of 6 columns was probably used as an audience hall and had a stone base for a throne against the rear wall. The side entrance led to a third private section of the palace at the rear, which is connected to a second throne room at the C section. The sides of the second throne room, again C, are the sanitary facilities, marked by D, and the bedroom, which is marked by E. The ground plan is actually comparable to the Amarna Villa, which includes 3 servant houses directly behind the palace, which are again designed according to the tripartite principle, which is the design in which many of the worker houses were built during the New Kingdom and other such eras, in which there were things like the Valley of the Kings going on, or the building of the pyramids. So the grandiosity of this particular establishment at Medinet Habu is a little odd at first because of just how much is going on in this building. Because generally all buildings are intended simply to provide a person with a dwelling space. That's their main purpose, regardless of the functions that the person carried out there. However, in this respect, the palace can be seen as a house magnified to monumental proportions, which is generally what the pharaoh would have wanted, is to be a person above all. It served as a dais for formal audiences. It served as a ritual starting point for Theban festival processions. And the central function of the palace, however, is to provide the pharaoh with a stage to reward officials from, the window of appearances. Now, the window of appearances is rather fun, and a little odd. It's in the center of the palace facade. So basically, we have an image of it here, and officials assembled below the window in the first temple court to attend the ritual called the distributing of the gold of honor. So the pharaoh would walk out into this window and throw gold, basically, and distribute it to his high officials. So we see on either side, pharaoh is persecuting his enemies in some way, attacking them, torturing them, tying them up, stuff like that. And underfoot, we can actually see the heads of the pharaoh's enemies. As the pharaoh steps out onto that balcony, he essentially tramples his enemies underneath his feet. Symbolically, of course. Palaces with a purely domestic function can actually be found in the southern end of western Thebes. It's part of the city built by Amenophis III, Malkata. So this residence is entered through 2 adjoining courts, each with a throne pedestal of its own, marked A and B. The border between the semi-official and private sectors is marked by a hall at right angles leading into a long corridor marked by D, and at the rear of this section were the king's actual private apartments. A 4-columned hall had an elevated seat marked with E with 3 rooms behind it. One recognizable by a niche can be known as the king's bedroom. Flanking the central hall, marked by D, are 2 groups of 4 rooms on both sides. They likely belong to the officials of the king's innermost circle, so his closest advisors and officials, essentially. Something fun about this palace is the wall and ceiling paintings. We can still see some of those in very bright colors that still last, and they're displayed all over the palace complex. The central hall is actually enhanced by floor paintings as well. Continuing on the painting subject, the northern palace of Amarna, which is the city built by Akhenaten, contained paintings of animals and plants which can almost be considered impressionistic in their use of style and color, as well as their theme, and this is all preserved in something that we call the green room. Now, in the center of Amarna is a gigantic complex of two buildings which are connected by a bridge. These two buildings are known as the Great Palace and the House of the King. There are a succession of rooms of a private nature, where it's likely that Akhenaten lived. The rear of the building had storerooms. The window of appearances opened into a courtyard in front of the house. Window of appearances we talked about like a minute ago. And there were towering columned halls at the south end of the palace, which provided an appropriate setting to receive foreign delegations and impress them. So I have a section outlined in my notes that I need to talk about governmental buildings. And I made these notes just because I wanted to have questions to answer, because when I look up different questions about Egypt, they're often very specific questions that have very hard to find answers. So I try to answer those types of like weird questions in some of these videos. But governmental buildings, they're basically just, they don't exist. All of the governmental duties of administration and such are just taken up by temples and palaces. So there's not really a need to go into governmental buildings and their design and architecture, because we already kind of went into it. So I'm going to move on to what the homes of officials looked like. So priests, high administrative officials, everything like that. They obviously had much better homes than the commoners that we looked over in the Pyramid Town section. So I wanted to look into the home of an official that worked at the Aten Temple. So this is situated on a generously proportioned property, so quite large, of about 340 square meters, a slightly elevated flat platform. It's surrounded by ancillary complexes like yards, workshops, gardens, barns, ovens, storage rooms, everything you need basically. So, like temples, officials had homes that were self-sustaining. They were gifts from the government essentially. You were paid a little bit in like copper or in bags of seed, barley, but a lot of the times what you were given for your work was a place where you could manage yourself. You could grow your own food, you could take care of yourself, you basically provide for yourself, so you wouldn't have to pay for food or anything. You'd just make it yourself. You'd keep your farms, you'd have your bakeries, all of that within your own property, for an official at least. These homes also had actually living quarters for servants. There was a high wall around the entire property which kept the rest of the population at bay. So for this property you enter through the anteroom, which is marked by A, and it is divided into 3 successive sections. The front section is dominated by a wide entrance hall with 4 support columns marked by B, and it contains adjacent side rooms. This front section could be termed the reception hall because of its size and, its grandiosity. In the south lays the middle section with the main hall in the center of the house. This is marked by C, and it was likely used for ceremonial purposes. All rooms, including the roof, were actually accessible from this room. In the rear of the property, there is a living room marked by D, which is solely domestic considering the furniture found there. There's a bedroom marked by E, and sanitary facilities with a built-in stone basin marked by F and G. Above the entrance hall, again C, is a loggia used as a cool sleeping place during the summer, and it overlooks a garden on the northern side. The flat roof is made of wooden beams and mud, and it is higher over the central hall than over adjacent rooms. For ventilation, there is clerestories which bring air and light into the hall, and that light also draws attention to the painted wooden columns and walls. Throughout this complex, we can see that the sparsely furnished rooms and the usable roof ensured the occupants could actually alleviate the rigors of the desert climate by choosing which part of the house to live in during the seasons. There's special positioning of windows and ventilation, and the arrangement of chambers and solid walls as well help to keep the heat out with climatically adjusted environments. Aesthetic considerations like lighting, color arrangement, and room proportions also influence the type of architecture used in these types of buildings. For example, the doors and columns are symmetrical in the Amarna Villa. I also have 2 sections here about commoner homes and city layouts, but I already went over those as well. Commoner homes can be basically summed down to what happens in the pyramid towns, and city layouts are essentially the same thing. So the very last thing I wanted to go over was something I actually mentioned at the beginning of this video, which is that there's a definite difference between New Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and Old Kingdom architecture. So the Old Kingdom, generally what we know of it and what I went over is what is going on in the Giza Plateau, which is near the pyramids, on the eastern side of Queen Khentkaus's tomb. We have the 11 priest houses, which is the luxurious living from the era. Obviously, we have the worker houses, which is the very most basic living conditions of the era, which is essentially a room to sleep in. I mean, all of the cooking and all that was basically done in the houses that you worked at, so like the villas of the priests and the officials and such. So you didn't really need any of that if you were just like a worker in a pyramid town. For the Middle Kingdom, a good example of that is the living quarters and priest villas of, again, the pyramid town of Sesostris II's tomb in El Ahun. There are a great number of workmen's houses nearby, and that makes up the main body of domestic architecture from the Middle Kingdom, around the 12th dynasties when that was. The main characteristic of these priest villas is, again, the open court to the north, and then the living quarters attached to the south. In the New Kingdom is, again, the best represented era of Egyptian architecture that we have. It's the most well-known, it's the best represented in both media and in the actual archaeological record. So the New Kingdom is essentially when they standardize the tripartite divisions. We can see in excavations of worker settlements in Deir el-Medina that we have entrance hallways that lead into a main living area or a low brick-built sleeping area. So pretty simple. The rear served as the kitchen and pantry. The stairway in the kitchen led to the roof, where the firewood was stored, and the roof was also where you'd continue to perform other domestic duties such as weaving and such. The total area, without including the roof, is about 70 square meters. And along with the villas of high administrative officials, the Amarna house type consequently became the archetype for pharaonic domestic architecture. It ultimately joined the ranks of the great designs of ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean domestic architecture. So basically all the information that I talked about comes from this book, and I don't remember exactly where I got it actually, but I think I actually got it from a friend. I don't know. But it's called Egypt, the World of the Pharaohs. It's got lots of very in-depth sections if you ever want to look more into depth about this kind of stuff. There's a section for the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, Early History, New Kingdom, Late Period, Greco-Roman. There's a state and society, gods, cults, and the Kingdom of the Dead. And then there's a whole section for investigations into the Nile Valley. So basically scholars, archaeologists, travelers, everyone that's gone through there and what they've recorded about it throughout the years. So it's a very thorough book. I would suggest it if you have the time or the money to look into it. This was obviously just a small section of it, so I hope you enjoyed.